we are going to look at how to structure a plot. A plot is simply a series of events that have been linked to form a story. The link between the events is usually causal, in that one event leads to or causes the next. Here we can see a well-known model of the structure or the shape of a plot. The plot begins with the introduction or the exposition. The tension increases during the rising action, building to a climax. After the climax, the tension falls as the plot is resolved and the story ends with some form of resolution for the audience. Here we have an annotated version of the same diagram with explanations of all the parts of the plot structure. The exposition, as we said, is the introduction, the way things are at the start of the story. The rising action is the series of conflicts or crises that lead to the climax and that cause the tension to rise or build. The climax is the turning point in the story, the moment of highest tension. I think the only thing I would say here is that in this diagram it looks like the climax is in the middle, but actually the climax should be probably later on in the story. The falling action is the kind of resolving action that follows the climax, and finally the resolution is the resolving of the different conflicts and problems in the plot. Now, in order to give examples of this type of plot structure, I'm actually going to use the well-known story, The Three Little Pigs. So we can see that the exposition is the introduction. It introduces the characters and the setting. In this case, we see that the pigs have an accommodation problem because there isn't enough room for them in their house. Having introduced some of the basic elements of the story, we now come to the inciting incident. This is the moment where the main problem or conflict is introduced. In this case, we see that the pigs, having solved their accommodation issues, are now faced with a much more serious challenge in the form of a wolf. As the story continues, the situation becomes increasingly complicated. This is known as the rising action. The story then builds to a moment of the highest tension, which is the climax, in this case when the wolf decides to come down the chimney. It is at this point in the story that we find out who the winners and losers are going to be. As the climax is a turning point, there is often a reversal of fortune. In this case, the wolf goes from being the villain to being the victim. The falling action continues the decrease in tension as the conflict or the problem is resolved. In this version of the story, by the wolf running out the door and never being seen again. Now, there are other versions of the story which have a more catastrophic outcome for the wolf. Finally, in the resolution of the story, the peace and order that prevailed at the beginning of the story is restored, the conflict is over, and the pigs can live happily ever after.